that there was no reason to go to that one. But otherwise, they found pretty much as we found, this was an attempt to overthrow the election result, to usurp the voting rights of the people, to interfere with a federal proceeding, and to establish a counterfeit electoral process to supplant the actual one that exists under the Constitution and under federal and state law. So I feel very pleased that this is such a vindication of the rule of law in America, and that this grand jury saw what the January 6th committee saw when we tried to analyze the chaos and the violence that had been unleashed against America, not just on January 6th, but in the weeks leading up to it.
All right, Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you so much for being with us. We are waiting for the special counsel to go to those microphones you're looking at. He's scheduled for 6 o'clock, and we'll go to him the minute he utters his first syllable. Until then, congressional correspondent Nicole Killion is outside of the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta. Nicole, remind us why you're there, and has there been any reaction down in Atlanta to this indictment?
Yeah, well, certainly this is on the radar of Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. In fact, we heard from the Fulton County Sheriff earlier today, who spoke to reporters, who echoed what we've heard from the district attorney here, is that they are ready to go in terms of their own case that they have been pursuing in regards to alleged 2020 election interference. And the sheriff noted that it is even possible that he could send a team to Washington to observe in the event that the former president is arraigned and makes a court appearance in Washington, D.C. That is something that they did not only in Miami when the former president appeared there, but also in New York to prepare, because we are currently in a window where the district attorney at any time could announce a charging decision in her investigation, which has spanned for more than 2 years. And of course, the centerpiece of that investigation is a phone call that was made to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in the days right before January 6th, where the former president pressed Raffensperger, saying, find me the 11,760 votes in an attempt or hope to perhaps overturn the election results here in the state of Georgia. We know that the Secretary of State not only appeared before a special purpose grand jury here in Fulton County, but also met with federal prosecutors. And that call is also cited in the indictment that was unsealed today. So while there is some overlap with these cases, of course, they are quite different in nature and scope as well. But we do expect a potential indictment here in Fulton County within a matter of weeks, John.
Nicole Killion, congressional correspondent in Fulton County, on just one of the portions of what the special counsel has called a criminal scheme by the former president that he alleges was launched just after Election Day on November 3rd, 2020. As far as the current sitting president is concerned, Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is with President Biden. Nancy?
John, we're in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where President Biden is on vacation, keeping a low profile. We have asked the White House for any reaction to this indictment, but we don't expect to get one, frankly. This White House repeatedly, when asked about indictments, when asked about charges against the former president, when asked anything about these ongoing investigations, tends to say nothing or as little as possible, referring us to the Department of Justice. Everyone at the White House, from the president on down, has said that they don't want to influence DOJ in any way. But that doesn't mean that President Biden hasn't weighed in on his predecessor's actions, especially when it comes to January 6th. He doesn't talk about it very often, but when he has been scathing, John. On the one-year anniversary of January 6th, he accused former President Trump of rallying the mob to attack. He said he watched it all on TV from the White House dining room near the Oval Office and did nothing for hours as police were assaulted. He accused him of spreading a web of lies, not just on January 6th, but months before the election even took place. And he said that the former president ignored what he was being told by his own attorney general, his own vice president, and governors from every state in the nation about the validity of the 2020 election. We don't hear much from this president anymore, particularly not as this investigation heated up about his predecessor's actions. He has tried to be very careful, knowing that this is going to be an ongoing issue as we get closer to his repeat matchup, if you will, against former President Trump.
Nancy Cordes with President Biden, White House correspondent. Thank you so much, Nancy. Scott MacFarlane has some more details as we wait for the special counsel to walk to the microphones. Scott, what do you know about the judge?
If you go to the last quarter of the indictment, you see references to January 6th. A lot of talk about fake electors, a lot of talk about what was known about the election. But if you get to the bottom quarter, you see references to what the special counsel calls the defendant's exploitation of the violence and the chaos at the Capitol. And one of the references is to then House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy in a conversation Donald Trump had during the riot with Kevin McCarthy, in which there was a reference, according to the special counsel, that you seem more concerned about the election than they seem more concerned about the election than you do, Mr. McCarthy. But also, note where this case is headed. It's headed here to Washington, D.C., to federal court, and assigned to Judge Tanya Chutkin, a 2014 appointee of this court, an Obama administration appointee who will be handling this case after the magistrate judge has her hearing with Donald Trump on Thursday.
Scott, briefly, and I might have to leave you because the special counsel's due any moment, but what's security like there, and how, I imagine when the former president shows up, it's going to be quite severe.
A lot of reinforcements here. The U.S. Marshals are here. U.S. Park Police and D.C. Police all have some type of foothold at this courthouse when there's major events. We expect that to ratchet up exponentially Thursday afternoon for this 4 p.m. Eastern Time court appearance.
Scott MacFarlane, thank you. Quickly, Jeff Pegues, the security, you've covered this now for this is the third one. Each time, significant measures have to be taken.
Yeah, and we didn't really see that in Miami. You saw the court appearance there. There weren't enough barricades was the concern. Miami police thought they did a good enough job. But in Washington, D.C., because of all of the landmarks here, because of all the public activity on the streets any given day, you're going to have to set up a lot of barricades. You're going to have to coordinate between federal and local law enforcement. And of course, on January 6th, there was criticism about how well or how intelligence and law enforcement efforts sort of fell apart leading up to January 6th. And so they're not going to want a repeat of that. Sure. They're going to make sure that they coordinate with D.C. Homeland Security to prepare.
And visually, it will be an echo, in a sense, if the former president's supporters arrive, as they did in Miami and as they did in Manhattan, it will echo the scenes of that very day.
Yeah, but the crowds have not been that big. Yeah. Why? Because a lot of people are facing criminal charges for following President Trump's orders and showing up here in Washington.
Certainly smaller numbers than the former president had hoped or led people to believe there might be on his behalf. One of the things that the indictment makes very clear, and it's an important point in this moment in American history, the indictment makes clear something that is fundamentally true but needs to be stated in a legal document like this. The defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and to even claim falsely that there had been outcome-determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the result of the election. I'm reading from the indictment directly. It also says, after exhausting all of those legitimate legal means and being shown that he lost, the president then became malicious about holding on to power. And the idea that he can speak about this, raise questions, pursue legal avenues, all of that is legitimate. And he did that. But once he lost there, he made a fundamental decision, one never before made by any sitting chief executive in the history of this country, to take other means to hold on to power. And that is the central question in this indictment and will be the central question before the jury.
There are rules for fighting these things out. He didn't play by them.
No.
And we build on what Major just said. It's such an important point. December 30th, 2020, Donald Trump has a conversation, then president, with Steve Bannon. Pence is on vacation as vice president. He says, get Pence home. Pence is now the target. Because as Major said, everything had failed for Trump and Giuliani in the courts. They were struggling to have any kind of strategy moving ahead. The electors had already voted in mid-December of 2020. December 30th, a turning point. Focus on Pence. That's what Bannon and other outside advisors tell Trump. And on January 3rd, Pence goes to the Senate parliamentarian, and she tells him, sir, you have nothing to do on January 6th except count the votes. He says, well, that's what my lawyers have been telling me. That's what I'm going to do. The next day, January 4th, 2021, John Eastman, the conservative lawyer who authors this blueprint for a coup, in the Oval with Pence. And Trump confronts Pence face to face in front of Eastman and other lawyers. And he says to Pence, listen to John. Almost threatening based on our reporting. Listen to John. Follow the Eastman plan. Pence says, I'll still think about it. Let me take my time, but I can't do it, Mr. President. The next day, Trump calls in on January 5th, Pence into the Oval Office for the ultimate one-on-one with Trump. Trump is so into the moment, and this has been confirmed by testimony in front of the January 6th committee. He opens the door to the Oval Office so he can hear the gathering mob outside on Freedom Plaza. A freezing cold night. Some of the aides to Trump walk in the Oval Office and they say to themselves, why is the door open? Gusts of air are coming in the room. But Trump wants to hear the mob outside, and he says to Pence, infamously, based on our reporting, you have to do this for me, Mike. You have to do this for me. Walk away from the certification on January 6th, because what was the hope? That the certification would be delayed. And if it was delayed, then the conspiracy would be effective in Trump's eyes, because the states where at least Republicans controlled the legislatures could send new electoral slates.
And Major, this is not just a question about the past. What you were talking about is there is a system for adjudicating disputes in America, and the president did not play by that system. And we're coming up with another election, and there are many people who thought it wasn't that he played outside the rules, it was that he didn't play hard enough outside the rules.
Well, there might be some who believe that. He could have played harder. I don't know quite how he could have played any harder. As Bob has articulated, he tried to use the Justice Department. He tried to use the Department of Homeland Security. He tried to use his political apparatus. He tried to convince state legislatures. I mean, just about every lever he could think of to pull, he tried to pull. And we have an established record on this. These are not disputable facts. They aren't. And the testimony that makes them indisputable facts comes from not Democrats who hate former President Trump, not think tank people who are not aligned with the Republican Party stalwarts, Trump administration stalwarts, people handpicked by the former president. They are the central and most important witnesses in this case, and they will be as this case unfolds. We've had close elections in our history, John. You know this as well as I do. 1800, 1824, 1876, 1960, 2000, and every single one of those close elections in which the fate of the country was in the balance for those who were most aggressively competing for that power. All of them had a central choice to make. Do I try to undermine this system, or do I live within its guardrails? Every single previous president lived within those guardrails until this one.
And one thing we have not mentioned, as a result of January 6th, 5 police officers died. I mean, think about those pictures. I will never forget the picture of the guy beating on the officer with an American flagpole. To me, that said it all. This was a mob attacking these police officers, and too often, I think, and I'm sure the families of the officers feel the same way, they get lost in all this. But that was a violent day.
Bob, Greg Jacob, lawyer for the vice president, as I recall, there's this question of whether the president was just listening to his lawyers. There was some testimony in the January 6th hearings, as I recall, that from Greg Jacob, that the president was told by John Eastman that this was not a legal theory, that this idea of fake electors was not legal, and that goes to this question.
You're basically asking Pence for a small violation of election law. That's a direct quote from the January 6th investigation.
There is in that testimony, which suggested that, which undermines this idea that the president
that it was foundational, that it was legitimate, that it was the body of understood law in America. It wasn't the body of understood law by any stretch of the imagination.
And what you see from John Eastman is someone who comes out of the orbit, who's not part of Trump's inner circle. But in the final days of the Trump administration, he's looking for anyone who's going to give him an exit ramp, a path to stay in power. That's why Sidney Powell is in the White House. She's up in the residence of the White House, talking with Trump about potentially seizing voting machines. And that's why John Eastman, who was not known by Trump, a lawyer from California, is brought in because he says, well, there might be a way. But you're right, Greg Jacob, the counsel for then Vice President Pence, In that January 4th meeting, Pence says to Eastman, why don't you just go meet with my lawyer, Greg Jacob, and hash it out? And so they have a private meeting in the old executive office building, John Eastman and Greg Jacob. And in that meeting, based on under oath testimony from Greg Jacob before the January 6th committee, Eastman reportedly says, well, I did afloat this theory to Trump, and I have authored this memo, but I'm not really sure it's going to hold water. And Jacob explodes. In fact, he's a mild-mannered person, but he explodes in terms of being a lawyer, saying, how is this circulating at the highest levels of the federal government? Yet Eastman persisted, because even on January 6th, when the Capitol is under siege, Jacob talks about how he's communicating with Eastman via text messages and email, and Eastman saying, follow the plan, follow the plan.
And Major, this is something the former president still believes now. All of these things, he hasn't changed his mind on the legality of it and the outcome of the election, as wrong as they both may be.
No, he hasn't. As a matter of fact, he's even waded into the possibility of becoming president again and issuing pardons for anyone implicated in this. So that puts in a nutshell his approach to the facts, to the law, and to power. If he reclaims it, he will pardon those who helped put this in motion.
Jeff Pegues, we got about a minute, apparently, until Jack Smith shows up. He doesn't say a whole lot when he comes out.
No, he doesn't. As you guys know, I sort of bumped into him on a plane to Miami, and I was just watching his mannerisms just to see if he would crack a smile with his team, maybe drink something. I didn't see anything like that. He seemed focused, even sitting. I think he was sitting in a middle seat, may have been a window seat, but sort of blended in. Most people on the plane, I don't think they knew who he was. And he wasn't trying to draw attention, but we just spotted him.
And what do we...
Part of history now.
Yeah. I think
indelibly.
he's done, I think, 100 triathlons, so I think he has the fortitude to make it through a middle seat. What do we know about his operation? It's been pretty unleaky, just as these kinds of investigations go. Does it have a character to it?
Jack Smith's character. The prosecutors that he has on that team, they are among the best. They are pros. They are major league prosecutors, and you see that because there really aren't a lot of leaks coming out of that office. People will say, "Oh, there really aren't that many leaks." They do their speaking through these court documents, and that's why these court documents are so detailed, because in a lot of ways they're trying to respond to what the former president puts out on social media.
Well, and that raises the question as we watch, perhaps here we have the special counsel entering the room now. And let's pause to listen to Jack Smith as he addresses reporters.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots, and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. I would like to thank the members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on this investigation with my office, as well as the many career prosecutors and law enforcement agents from around the country who have worked on previous January 6th investigations. These women and men are public servants of the very highest order, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. Thank you.
Why didn't you charge any of the other co-conspirators?
And there we have Special Prosecutor Jack Smith saying this is an unprecedented act, an attack on the bedrock function of democracy. He was typically laconic. Bob Costa.
One thing to note that the special counsel did not is former Vice President Mike Pence, based on this document, is a central, crucial, key witness in this investigation. This indictment says Pence took contemporaneous notes, and date after date of Pence's recollection of events is there. We know Pence met for hours with the grand jury, but to have a former vice president who was in the room with Trump, often one-on-one, in the Oval Office, and now testifying in detail to the special counsel, he could end up being the most important witness in this case.
Because do you think, Bob, it's not just X happened after Y, but he has some ability to speak to what was inside the former president's
And he can
head.
speak to possible criminal intent. Now, Pence has said publicly he does not know, and it's not for him to judge whether Trump had criminal intent in his actions. But by Pence detailing what Trump said, for example, this indictment says Pence recalled Trump calling him not too honest, as they had a private conversation about the election. And so Pence is someone who was weaponized at the end of the presidency for Trump. And to have him cooperating with the investigation gives the special counsel an eyewitness account that someone who's not a lawyer or some Trump functionary.
And to put this in a political context, let's also remind ourselves that the former vice president is now challenging the former president for the nomination of the Republican Party in 2024. So he is a witness against the former president, as Bob Costa just outlined, and is a political opponent against him. And he is a primary fact witness and a constitutional empowered officer of the executive branch. And that makes him the most important, or if not the most important, one of the most important fact witnesses, because he saw this entire progression of the argument through all of the ways that Trump was thwarted through the legal means of challenging the election. Then he went to extra legal means, and he was the recipient of maximum pressure on that extra, according to the indictment, extrajudicial pressure to overturn the election.
But go ahead. Here's the thing. You know, a lot of this obviously allegedly happened behind closed doors. But what's so frustrating sometimes about the former president is that he'll say things publicly where a prosecutor or even his own attorney would be flabbergasted, just telling him, please stop, don't keep putting this information out there. So a lot of what is in this happened publicly.
We're going to turn now to Scott Frederickson, a former federal prosecutor. Scott, what's your take after taking a look at this and listening to the special prosecutor in his remarks?
Yes, I think one thing that strikes anyone who has watched Special Counsel Smith is that he does not show emotion very often. He showed emotion today when he talked about the fact that this indictment is brought consistent with the prosecutions of the individuals responsible for the deaths of 5 law enforcement officers and the mob, the violent mob that attacked the Capitol. And when he talked about that here at his brief news conference, you could see he was emotional about that, and that is driving him when he said this was an assault on democracy fueled by lies of a president.
And just to underscore that, Scott, so the point is that while in the political realm this might get discussed in all kinds of maybe even abstract ways or in political terms, what it sounds like he was doing is saying 2 bedrock principles: accountability and also that there were real victims here who held the line when somebody else was trying to cross it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what surprises most of us here is how much of the January 6th events have been made a part of this indictment. Many thought that he would avoid that and the incitement of the violent mob coming up the Capitol. Instead, it's a central part of the indictment, especially when he gets into the detailed rendition of the attempts to change the vice president's mind in almost a Shakespearean mano face-off, but detailing falsehoods over and over again told by the former President Trump in an attempt to change the vice president's mind.
Former federal prosecutor Scott Frederickson, thank you. Ricky Kleeman, our CBS News legal analyst, is with us now. Ricky, you've taken a longer look at this indictment. What else have you concluded?
Earpiece.
We're going to go back to Ricky in a second. Bob Costa, you know the players so well in this drama. Sticking with your idea, your point about the president being the central actor here, if Mike Pence is another key person, who else are you looking for as a useful witness for some of what we don't know or what the special prosecutor may have come up with in this indictment?
So I'll always remember the night of January 5th. I was outside the Willard Hotel. And while Trump had a hotel for most of the time he was president of the United States in Washington, down on Pennsylvania Avenue, the other Trump hotel on the eve of the insurrection was the historic Willard Hotel. Because inside that hotel on January 5th, Rudy Giuliani, Steve Bannon, and so many of their associates were calling Republicans in Congress. They were pressuring them to do Trump's bidding. They infamously issued a statement saying Pence was in agreement with Trump's position on January 6th, even when he was not, causing Pence to erupt along with his aides and say that's false. And so you have the Willard under the microscope now. Everyone who was inside the Willard plotting with Giuliani and Boris Epstein and all these other associates to try to overturn the election, and those outside who were intense getting ready for the rally the next day and to attack the Capitol, and then of course across the street at the White House talking to Trump late into the night. All of these people are now in the spotlight based on this indictment of the special counsel. He is not just painting this based on this indictment as something that was a bit of a bad idea gone wrong. He is saying that there was criminal intent to deceive the American people, to defraud the United States, and to mount a multi-pronged conspiracy. It's hard to digest that this is being alleged to happen, and it's being done by the Justice Department at the highest levels against the Republican frontrunner.
Right, indeed.
And the indictment pays the former president a compliment indirectly, in the sense that his vocalizing falsehoods about the election had a dramatic, galvanizing, and impassioning effect on much of the country. Reading from page 2. To make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. The indictment says the former president achieved all of that just by the sound of his voice. Mm-hmm. Conferring upon him one of the things that former President Trump likes to say about himself. He has a movement, he has a voice, and people respond to it. All true, former President Trump. But you use that voice, you use that influence in ways that are now putting you in criminal danger.
Knowingly used it to advance a criminal scheme. Ricky Kleeman is apparently back on the line. Ricky, you've taken a further look at this indictment. What do you come up with?
When I look back, John, at my prosecutorial days, what I wanted to know were who are the victims, what did they suffer, and how did they suffer? Well, the major victim here, of course, is democracy. The secondary, or perhaps in tandem victim, are the American people. The third victim are the American voters. All of those go together. But when we look at the individual paragraphs, what we have to remember, in addition to the people in Congress who might have suffered serious bodily harm, injury, and even death, what we have to also look at is Mike Pence as a central victim in this indictment, and that Mike Pence became a person that Donald Trump, according to the indictment, wanted to do his bidding. And that was to change the election result, that Mike was supposed to do the quote-unquote right thing. But when he didn't, at the time that the Capitol is being breached, that Donald Trump's tweet, when he goes and says that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country, etc., which is in paragraph 111, that is what spurs on the chance of hang Mike Pence. And if Mike Pence had not been spirited away by his Secret Service, he might not be running for the nomination today.
CBS legal analyst Ricky Kleeman, thank you so much, Ricky. Now we want to go to Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who has a thought. Nancy?
John, it was notable in that brief statement that we just heard from the special counsel Jack Smith. One of the things he did say was that he's going to be seeking a speedy trial. That's notable because we know that he's not getting a speedy trial in the case in Florida having to do with former President Trump's handling of classified documents. That case is not going to go to trial until at least mid-2024, just a few months before the presidential election. If he were to get a speedy trial in this case, let's say early 2024, then the trial could take place and we could have an outcome well before the 2024 election takes place in November, possibly even before the end of primary season. And that's notable, of course, because President Trump is currently the runaway frontrunner, according to recent polls. And actually, his lead appears to be growing all the time. This is something that the Biden campaign is obviously watching very closely because they are anticipating a matchup again against former President Trump. But when we asked the Biden campaign whether they had any reaction to this new indictment, they said, as predicted, no comment.
Nancy Cordes, thank you, Nancy. Scott Frederickson, I want to bring you back in on something that Nancy hinted at. The calendar, but let's forget the political calendar for the second. How does whoever is in charge here operate all these different investigations and indictments and court trials all at the same time? There are the president's indicted 3 times, plus there are several civil cases. How does all that get coordinated?
Well, it's a good question. There's no formula. It's not provided for in any federal rule, let alone any state rule. Oftentimes, it's the first case indicted, and they take it in turn. But I think what's interesting here is that this case, which will come to the arraignment for the former president on Thursday, this case could actually jump ahead of the Mar-a-Lago documents case for one important reason. There are no classified documents involved in this case, and the classified documents are a serious complexity in the Mar-a-Lago scheduling. It takes a lot of time to work through those issues. There are none of that issues here. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if this judge, the new judge here in Washington, took this case and moved it ahead and moved it into early 2023 ahead of the Mar-a-Lago case. Of course, the former president will fight that and want to delay it till after the trial. But I think the judge could also make a point that this is the most important case. This is the one indictment that charges criminal conduct while the president was in fact in office as the president, unlike the other cases. So it goes to the heart of kind of the most important charges against him. So I could see this case getting moved forward in an earlier time spot.
All right, Scott Frederickson, thank you for that analysis of the calendar. Once again, former President Trump has been indicted by the special counsel on 4 counts tied to his attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Among the charges include conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruction of an official proceeding. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. For all of us here in Washington, I'm John Dickerson.
Hello, I'm Weijia Jiang.
Northwestern University is enlisting a former U.S. Attorney General to investigate the school's hazing scandal. Loretta Lynch will lead an independent review of Northwestern's athletics department and the school's procedures for reporting and responding to misconduct. The university faces several lawsuits alleging hazing in its football program. Now, coming up at 4:30, one expert tells us how Northwestern's latest move follows the same playbook used amid the Penn State scandal. The woman who investigators say was drunk driving and killed a bride on her wedding day appeared in court today. This happened near Charleston, South Carolina at the end of April. 25-year-old Jamie Komorowski is charged with reckless homicide and DUI in the tragic crash. Police say she rear-ended a golf cart with 4 people on it, including the bride who was killed and the groom who was seriously hurt. The victim's family gave emotional statements as Komorowski was denied bond.
So I do believe she's a danger to the community because I wouldn't want anybody else to go through this. It's torn apart our family.
The couple had just married earlier that night. 2 other family members on the golf cart with them were hurt.
Police in Memphis say a Jewish school's strict safety procedure may have stopped a potential mass shooting. Police say a former student armed with a gun when he made it into the school's campus, but not inside the building. He fired several shots outside before driving off. Police leaders thanked school staff and officers for their quick and possibly life-saving actions.
I personally truly believe that we have avoided a tragedy. I think this suspect was going to harm somebody before the day was over, and that our officers were able to intervene and protect the citizens.
Officers caught up with him and ended up shooting him during an armed confrontation. That suspect's in critical condition, and Tennessee state investigators have now taken over that investigation.
At least 20 people have died, 24 are missing, and tens of thousands have been forced to leave after wide